everybody. This is Alan Feldman from Laguna Woods Democratic Club. Welcome to Black in Laguna Woods, and thank you for taking the time to watch today. Today, we're going to be speaking with Keshia Adeniyi-Dorsey. Now, she is an attorney, but she's an attorney who works really in one major field, and that is she works with families and children who are involved with California Child Protective Services and the foster care system. We usually hear about these two systems when some tragedy befalls, when some young child gets killed somehow or abused beyond belief. But a lot of things go on in those systems that we're not looking, kind of behind the scenes, that we don't know about. Some of them I'm sure are good, some of them I'm sure are not that good. But that's what we're going to be talking about today. It's one of the things we'll be talking about today. So let me introduce Keshia Adeniyi-Dorsey. I want to thank you so much for taking your time for being here with us today. It's greatly appreciated, your time and sharing your expertise and knowledge. So before we start talking about what you do, why don't you tell us a little about who you are, where you're from, your background, just a bit.
Thank you, Alan. So just by way of background, so oftentimes when people ask me from where I'm from, I say I'm from Southern California, just because I've lived in so many different places in Southern California. But if I had to choose a place, people say to choose where you went to high school, and I went to Diamond Bar High School. I am one of 8 siblings, 4 boys, 4 girls. Absolutely love my siblings to death. I am a wife, I am a mother. And just a little bit about my educational background. I did graduate from the University of California, Irvine, double majored in psychology and criminology, and a minor in African American studies. I then went to law school at Southwestern Law School, and I currently am a family defender here in California, where I seek justice on behalf of families by suing CPS agencies when our families' rights are not being protected or being violated. I also represent parents in CPS cases, but really through the lens of family integrity. I also serve as an adjunct professor at Southwestern Law School, where I teach students and really trying to indoctrinate them and get more students to become family defenders, because we really do need really great litigators in the space. And I also serve on a national committee, the American Bar Association, Commission on Youth at Risk, and I think we'll talk a little bit about my work there during our presentation today.
So I'm curious about the law. You chose the law as a career. So I guess my question is, did you choose the law or did the law choose you?
I love that question. I would say that the law chose me. So, throughout my childhood, I think like being a lawyer was something that was cliche to me. And I've always been a person that's like, I want to do something different than what everybody else is doing. And so even though like when we would take those like quizzes to see like what kind of profession would you be good at, law would always come up, and I was like determined that I was not going to be a lawyer. So when I went to undergrad, as I shared earlier, was a double major in criminology and psychology. And one of my criminology professors had essentially invited me to do research with her. And we did research on the Adoptions and Safe Families Act and its impact on incarcerated moms. And we don't have to go into too deep into the Adoptions and Safe Families Act, but I'll just kind of give a brief kind of overview. But basically, the Adoptions and Safe Families Act, also known as ASFA, is federal legislation that puts timelines on reunification. So if your child is taken from you and put into the foster system, what this federal legislation says is that parents have to get their children out of the system within 15 out of the last 22 months. Otherwise, states are required to initiate termination of parental rights proceedings. And termination of parental rights proceedings, we also call the civil death penalty, because once your parental rights are terminated, unless a court of appeal or higher court overturns the juvenile court, your parental rights are terminated forever. And so what we found through the research was that the average sentence for women at that time, and at that time in our history, we were seeing an increase in women becoming incarcerated. That's why we were looking at that. issue. The average sentence for women at that time was 18 months. So they were 3 months shy of this federal, you know, requirement, and they were coming home right after having served sentences that had nothing to do with abuse or neglect of their child, but simply that they were in custody for too long and they were receiving the civil death penalty. Their parental rights had been terminated. Okay. Not only had their parental rights been terminated, but the timeline in which for them to file an appeal of those parental rights oftentimes would also have passed. Okay. And so that research literally motivated me to go to law school. My professor at the time would have to extend all my deadlines for getting work to her because I would be so ingrained in all the cases that I was reading and the stories of the families that I was reading that I would have to keep asking her, can I have more time? Because I'm reading this, and then I found this, and I would just go into this other, just tunnel and just trying to research all of this. I was just so appalled. And then my own, doing that research too, I think also allowed for me to learn about a system that had impacted my entire life. So I was also motivated to really kind of just learn as much about the system as I could because I didn't know much about, the law that had really shaped my life and the life of my siblings and my family. And so my professor was like, if you like reading cases, if this work is important to you, there's not a lot of folks, focusing on this particular area of the law. And she encouraged me to go to law school. And I went to law school. I loved law school. I focused my studies in law school on this particular area of the law. I sat for the California bar, passed the bar on a Friday. On Monday, I was in court as a family defender representing parents in these cases.
Just like to pick up a couple of things, a couple of questions I had when you were going through it. It's a mandate from what you're telling us that if people don't move to have their families reunited within 22 months, they're going to lose all rights.
Right,
And I'm hearing you right. I mean, they're going to lose all rights in perpetuation and
right,
forever.
right, right, right.
The right word didn't come to my mouth there, so we'll just say in ever.
Right. So, one of the things that I'm just tied also to just kind of my personal story and experience, right? So, um, I grew up in the system from the age of 2 until I, quote unquote, aged out of the system and didn't know at the time, right? That doing this work, representing parents, was actually also God preparing me, right, for my ability to be able to reconnect with my parents and understand the hoops, the the difficulty it is for parents to get their children back home, right, after a case has been opened. And it depends on what the issue is too, right? So if we're dealing with issues, for example, a substance use disorder, then you know the time frame, right, for someone to get clean, right, if that's the basis for having a child put into the system, is even, it's hard for someone to get clean in that, short period of time. The other thing that I didn't share is that the federal guidelines is the ceiling, okay? It's not the floor. So that means that states can actually set even more restrictive timelines for reunification. And California does that. So in California, if you have a child under the age of 3 and the courts can terminate parental rights at 6 months. If you have a child over the age of 3, then the courts could terminate your services at 12 months. Okay, so we have shortened time frames in California. There's also the subjective, right, you know, um, situation where you see families who are maybe not quote unquote cooperating or getting along with the social worker, where the social worker can say, you did everything the court told you to do, but I don't think you learned from those services. And so we are going to recommend for your parental rights to be terminated. Okay. We also have, situations where our parents, our families cannot afford to do the things that the court is asking them to do, or they lose everything. So we've had people who lose their housing as a result of having these cases. And then when it's time for the child to come home, then the reason why the child can't come home is because they don't have housing, or they don't have the resources that they need, right? And when it comes to Black children, throughout every single stage of these proceedings, whether it's a CPS investigation and who gets investigated, whether it is the rate of removal of children, whether it is the way in which those children are protected while they're in the system, right? Whether the resources that they're given when they're in the system, the resources that families are provided in the system, at every stage, the amount of termination of parental rights, Black children are at the forefront of every single one of those stages. And so it is challenging, it's difficult, it takes an emotional toll also on families. The two things that the court is looking at to determine whether your child's at risk of being returned to you, is have you completed and checked these boxes on the case plans they give you to complete, and whether you're visiting your child. Up until 2023, so last November, some counties like LA County, which is the largest foster system in the country, they did not pay for families to participate in services. So sometimes families just couldn't afford to complete the things that the court advised them to do, or they couldn't afford to travel, right? Sometimes hours, having to take multiple forms of public transportation to go to visit their children, right? And that would be the basis in which a court would say, your child can't come home. The other thing that's important to know is that these cases, over 70% of them nationally, are cases involving neglect. So we're taking children and putting them into the system. We're paying other people to take care of those children, when we could, if it is a financial need of the family, right, we could provide those services or those resources, financial resources, to parents. But our federal government doesn't allow for that. They don't provide the same amount of funding for keeping families together as they do for taking children out of the home.
But what are the kinds of things that an investigation can be started about? Who can initiate an investigation?
Oh, wow. So we have, first, I want to just start off really quickly by saying that there are literally millions of investigations that happen every year, okay? And a very small percentage of those investigations actually become cases, all right? So part of what I also try to do with just public education is to explain the harms of just the investigation, okay? And I can give you numbers, actually. I have numbers here. So this is just number from 2020, okay? From 2020, agencies received a total of 3.9 million reports of abuse and neglect, okay? 65.7% of these reports came from law enforcement personnel and other quote unquote helping professionals. So, your educational professionals, medical professionals, social services, mental health professionals, okay? And at this stage, again, one of my passions is really explaining just the disproportionate impact that this has on families, that Black children were reported twice as often as white children, okay? And in LA County, again, the largest foster system in the country, nearly 60% of Black children experience a CPS investigation, okay? And so part of the reason of the way in which these cases come forth is a call to the quote unquote CPS hotline, okay? And it comes, like I said, majority from helping professionals, which are also considered mandated reporters. Mandated reporters, we've been doing a lot of work trying to, get rid of these laws, repeal mandated reporting laws. But mandated reporting laws literally put potential criminal liability on these helping professionals or folks who are identified as mandated reporters if they do not report suspected abuse and neglect of children, okay? So they have to report per the mandated reporting laws. Okay. And one of the things that we see is that sometimes people just don't know who to call. So if a child doesn't have certain needs, right? Because teachers and law enforcement are the number one reporters to this particular hotline. Um, they may not have what they need. Instead of getting those children resources, support, they're going to call the hotline, right? So that's pretty much how cases are initiated. Sometimes cases are initiated by landlords to try to get people out of their homes. Sometimes it's initiated by family members. And the other challenge with mandated reporting is that, in a criminal context, if someone were to accuse you of a crime, you have the absolute right to cross-examine that person, right? If it becomes a case, to be able to try to prove what their bias might have been in making the allegation about you, what their motive would have been, right? For you to determine the credibility of the allegation, right? In CPS cases, mandated reporting reporters their information is kept confidential. So if there is a like grandmother, your mother-in-law who, right, hates you and, wants to call in a report, you can't go and cross-examine that person to, right, show what their motive or bias might have been. Like, oh, I broke up with her, with her son and she hates me or whatever, right? Or another parent, right? Sometimes parents weaponize the system in family law cases, so in custody proceedings, right? Where you'll see parents who will call in and say a parent did something, right? Um, and so there's all types of, ways in which these cases kind of like the entry point. But I think the point that I want to highlight is that these investigations are very harmful to families. They're traumatic. For children to have the threat of potentially being taken from their parents is serious. In California, parents are entitled to representation during CPS cases, but they're not entitled to representation during the investigation phase of a CPS case. And so social workers oftentimes wield their power in a way, that there's a power imbalance. They will bring law enforcement sometimes to these investigations. They will have children subject to body scans and having to get, intrusive medical exams. For parents, sometimes they have them submit to drug testing without a court order or warrant. They come into people's homes without court orders and warrants. And unless you have an attorney to be there for you during those investigations, oftentimes, if you try to exercise your rights, so if you say, I don't want you coming into my home unless you have a warrant, social workers will say, well, I'm going to tell the judge you're being uncooperative, or they'll use the very fact that you exercise your rights to go and try to seek a warrant to come into your home, to remove your children from you. And that's really honestly the bread and butter of the civil rights practice I do when I sue CPS agencies.
It's kind of like without being convicted of a crime, actually, in many cases, not even being accused of a crime,
Mhm.
you're immediately put on parole or probation,
Mhm.
where the authorities have the right to come in anytime unannounced and to make sure you're living on the straight and narrow.
Mm.
That's what it kind of sounds like to me. You haven't been accused of a crime necessarily. Certainly haven't been convicted, but we're going to monitor your life to make sure you're doing the way we want to do it. What do you think the effects are? I mean, you've been doing this for a while, so I'm sure you know. And you say,
Mhm.
which I want to ask you. Hopefully, we're going to have time. I want to ask you a little bit about. You
Yeah.
mentioned your own personal journey
Yeah.
through
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
But but on this, what do you see as the effects that this system has on children and on families? I mean, it seems to me that when you get involved with this, it's going to have a destructive effect most of the time. Sometimes I'm sure it actually helps people, but other times I'm sure it's pretty destructive on families and children.
Right. So I'll turn to, one of the consequences potentially, right, of these cases, which is family separation, whether it's temporary or long term. There's been so much research and data that came out of when we were looking at the children who were being separated from their parents when we had, migrant children trying to come into the U.S. in 2020. There was tons of research studies from medical professionals, from researchers talking about the trauma, the physiological consequences, right, that children and families suffer as a result of family separation, including brain damage, right, that children suffer. There's ambiguous loss that children suffer. There is the disruption of the child family relationship, right, and bonds. One thing that I always like to also highlight, and we can, maybe use this to kind of talk a little bit about my personal experience, is the complete separation that you can have from your bloodline, right? So it's not just your immediate family disconnect from you, the children and the parents, but it can also cut you off from your grandparents, from your aunties, from your uncles, right? Where you end up, right, as the top of your family tree as a child, right? And that's how me and my siblings have, feel about our, experience and existence here, right? We have our birth parents, we've met our birth parents, but because of the time frame in which we were disconnected from them, those relationships cannot be put back together, and formulated in the way that they would have been, had we had the ability to be raised under our parents' care and custody, and vice versa, right? And so when my siblings need things, I mean, we're the line, right? Most of our, my siblings, our children don't know their grandparents, right? And so causes disruption. I think that the way that the system is set up is genocidal as it pertains to communities like the Black community, like Indigenous communities in this country, because of the prevalence of how this system impacts our families. The other piece is just the constant threat of family separation, right? And so, again, not to go too deep, but if we look at, the ways in which our economy was dependent upon the threat of separation and Black family separation during chattel slavery, we have that same situation today in 2024, right? Where you have this constant threat of family separation. When my little girl gets injured, I have to literally do this analysis of like, should I take her to go to the medical professionals to get support and to get help, right? Or do I try to figure it out on my own? Because if I take her into the hospital, they may accuse me of abusing my child, right? Or when we see situations where people are involved in domestic violence situations and they go to get help for their domestic violence as a survivor of it, and their children get taken from them, right? And so there's this constant kind of, threat of family separation as well. And then the trauma that happens. So even if families are reunified, there's no resources provided to families for that healing process, right? Children are not provided with, therapy to deal with, having been taken from mommy and daddy, and how to reconcile that and how to, right, move forward in that. And so it leaves families like really like broken. And that when we think about the strength of our community, right? Our community's strength is drawn from our family units. And the more we continue to fray our family units through systems like the family policing system, I call it family policing, people call it child welfare, but the family policing system, through our carceral systems, right? We having entries and exits out of communities, right? That continues to weaken our community.
So once you get involved in that system, it seems like it's structured for you to head downhill. We are running out of time, and I know you have a
Yeah.
personal story, but I
Mhm.
also know you're very much involved with an American Bar Association.
Yes.
They think it's called the Commission on Youth at Risk.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I'm gonna make the editorial decision
Okay.
here
Okay.
to go to
Okay.
that and ask you about that, what that
Okay.
is, how you became involved. We got about 5 minutes.
Okay, awesome. So the American Bar Association is the largest and oldest bar association in our country. Over 300,000 attorneys. At one point, Black people were excluded from that particular association, and so I was a little hesitant to get involved with the ABA. However, I learned that they were working on a resolution that has been passed called Resolution 606, where the American Bar Association has identified, has acknowledged, has resolved, right, that we have a history of Black family separation in this country that continues through our current quote unquote child welfare system today, right? And so it really calls upon legal professionals to learn the history of Black family separation in this country and see all the connecting dots in regards to how Black children became a part of that system, because prior to the 1960s, we were not a part of that system. And I don't want to go too deep into that, but I just want to try to see if I can squeeze it in with our time here. So prior to the 1960s, Black children were largely excluded from the foster system because welfare was only afforded to white families. We won the right to have access to welfare. And when we won the right to have access to welfare, they passed a rule called the Fleming Rule that said you have to provide resources and welfare to families, right, including Black families, all families, unless you remove their children. So with that law, the federal government also pumped millions of dollars into the separation of Black children through Title 4E, right? And it increased the population of the system. In 1 year, Black children went from virtually non-existence to nearly 25% of that system. And not based upon, their abuse or neglect of their children, but literally because of their being denied access to welfare. And so I don't have really time to get into all of that, but that's what the resolution calls on. It traces that history. I'm happy to provide the text for that, the resolution for that as well, so people can read on that. We've been doing presentations across the country regarding that history.
Yeah, it's kind of trying to educate people to the system. Well, it sounds like they set up a system which incentivizes taking the children away
It
from their parents
does.
because
It does.
it's the simplest thing and it's the easiest thing. Wow. Uh, is who's you got to wonder who does that serve? Who's a system like that? Who does that serve? Uh,
Right.
and you talked about I got maybe a minute here. One more question.
Hmm.
You talked about this entire system having a disproportionate effect on people of color, families of color.
Hmm.
Uh, do you feel that that's economic or racial or a combination both?
I think it is racial because, again, prior to the 1960s, we were not included in the system. Okay. And then after the 1960s, children got taken for things like neglect. Oh, prior to the 1960s, too, you didn't get taken, children didn't get taken for neglect. It was only for abuse. Okay. So after the 1960s, it became, again, the racial dynamics or demographics of the system drastically changed. And so even in California, 80% plus of the children removed from their parents is for neglect. It's not for abuse.
No.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, we have bumped into time. I'm sorry we didn't get a
Yeah.
chance to hear for your
Okay.
personal
Okay.
story here, although you've kind of
Yeah.
expressed your
Yeah.
feelings about it. I want to thank you so much for not only being here today, but I want to thank you for the work that you do. You are obviously an eloquent spokesman for people who
Thank
need
you.
assistance the most at a time when they need it the most. I can imagine that your psychological education probably has come in good stead when you've dealt with some of your clients and the
Mhm.
situations that they're in. And again, I want to thank you so much for being here today and to really educating us. We don't know a lot
Mhm.
about this system. Most of us
Right.
don't
Right.
have contact with it. Well, as I
Right.
said at the beginning, all we know is when somebody dies, oh, they didn't do their job, and uh, that kind of thing. And sometimes it's true and sometimes it's not. But thank you so much for the work that you do. And it was really a pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you again. And I may be calling you again down the
Okay.
line because I want
Awesome.
that personal story.
Okay.
It sounds like it would be one worth telling. But thank you very much again.
Thank
And
you.
for everybody watching, thank you for watching, and we'll see you soon.